Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland, and this video is to mark Her Majesty the Queen's birthday. So today, 21st of April, Her Britannic Majesty attains 93 years of age. Well, perhaps I shouldn't tell her the lady's age. I should merely have said that she was born in the year of grace, 1926. Very few people would know where she was born. Yes, London, but more precisely, Bruton Street. I remember meeting a French waiter who was working on Bruton Street, and he had no idea she was born down the street. Unfortunately, the building where she's born no longer stands. There's a plaque on that site, which I've got to film out. And it's just a very bland modern office block there. I wonder whether her birth house was destroyed in the Second World War or something. So you may be surprised to learn that she was not born in Buckingham Palace or any palace or castle. So her father was the Duke of York. My grandfather was King George V. And the second son of the monarch traditionally gets the title Duke of York. So the Queen's father was the second son of King George V. That's why the Queen's father, he had the title Duke of York. It gets rather complicated going to what his personal name was, because the Queen's personal names are Elizabeth, Alexandra, Mary. So royalty, they usually have 3 forenames at least. It could be 4, 5, 6. By a forename, I mean like personal names. Or Americans might say first name and middle name, but you might have several middle names. Anyway, so the Queen's mother was from the Bowes-Lyon family, one of the noblest families in Scotland. So the Queen's mother was also named Elizabeth. This is where it got very confusing. So the current Queen is Elizabeth II, and her mother was often called Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, as opposed to Elizabeth II. So the current Queen has got a regnal number, the second, because she's a Queen regnant. She reigns. She is Queen inasmuch as she inherited the title from her own family, not because she married into it. Whereas Elizabeth II's mother was a Queen consort. She was Queen because she was married to the King. She did not inherit the title from her own family. So Elizabeth II's mother was born at Glamis Castle in North Britain. And it's mentioned in Shakespeare, well, in Macbeth. Notice it's spelt Glamis, but pronounced Glamis. So her father was the Earl of Strathmore. You can look back into the Queen's family tree, and I've looked back to it many generations, and you have to go a very long way back before you find a Mr. or a Miss. They're always the princess this, prince of that, Grand Duke whoever, the Earl of this, the Margrave of that, Viscount this, Duchess of the other, things like that. Also noble titles. A commoner, she has very few of those, so she has a many quarter escutcheon. They were almost all of armorial rank for many generations back there. Polar opposite of me, because I am of hoi polloi. Anyway, so Elizabeth II's father, well, he was known as Albert within the family, and we're going to all his forenames. So a great book, a source you want to know about the Queen's childhood, is to read The Little Princesses by Crawford, her nanny, Marion Crawford. Anyway, so that was that. They were living in London, but they obviously went to Buckingham Palace, sometimes Windsor Castle. They went to Balmoral every August since Queen Victoria purchased that in 1861 to get over the death of her husband, Prince Albert. So that's the custom. Every summer, the royal family decamps to Balmoral in Aberdeenshire, their private estate. They have no official visitors there, can let their hair down out of the glare of the media. So Elizabeth II met George V. George V said he'd been petrified of his own father, and he made sure that his own children weren't frightened of him, to some extent his grandchildren too. As Marion Crawford wrote, King George V had something of a quarterdeck voice. He was a Royal Naval officer and a salty manner. Wasn't a very warm grandfatherly figure. George V was ailing. He had 5 sons. He had 1 daughter. His youngest son, Prince John, died in 1919, age 14. He was, had extreme learning difficulties. So he's the lost prince, as they say. You should see the 2002 docudrama about him. So George V was ailing, and his eldest son was known as David within the family. So George V breathed his last in January 1936, as Lord Dawson of Penn, the royal physician, wrote in a bulletin, "The King's life is drawing peacefully to a close." Lord Dawson of Penn tried to ease the King's passing by administering a fatal dose of morphine, and indeed recorded as much in his diary. It's these days it would be considered astonishing he wasn't prosecuted for murder, but there we were. It had been suggested that His Majesty, the Emperor of India, George V, take a rest cure at Bognor Regis, to which he replied, Bugger Bognor. This town on the south coast, Bognor Regis, Regis as in of the king, or Royal Bognor. So anyway, he died in January 1936, and he was succeeded by his son. So his son took the name George VI, right? So very confusing. What they're known as amongst the family and their regnal name are different, because they had several forenames. But so George VI, what am I talking about? Not George VI. Edward VIII. Edward VIII took over in 1936. He's David. Edward VIII took over in January 1936, and then Mrs. Simpson came along. I shan't go into that too much, but his liaison with this American divorcee, in fact twice divorced woman, who was almost 40, had not born a child, assumed to be barren. That's how cruelly they would have put it at the time. So there was the abdication crisis. Anyway, 10th of December 1936, Edward VIII abdicated in favour of his brother. I, Edward, by the grace of God, King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Emperor of India, Defender of the Faith, and C, set forth by my own hand this instrument of abdication. And so he renounced the throne for himself and for his children, any children he might have, forever, and obviously handed over to the next brother down the line. That is his brother Albert, and Albert was known as George VI. So that's the Queen's father, how he became George VI. So you should see the Queen's speech. And the Queen's father, he was a very bland and diffident character, retiring sort of person, who very much had greatness thrust upon him, who hated the limelight, and was a timid sort, into things, not people, spoken almost a monotone, very tongue-tied. And that was it. But anyway, he was forced into this position, and he did his duty manfully. So I remember in 1930, the Queen had a sister come along. That's Princess Margaret. You should see the newsreels at the time. BBC Movie Tone News was shown in the cinemas because nobody had a television until 1936. And it was said, the birth of a girl will come as a disappointment. The nation had prayed for a prince. They were that frank about it, preferring boys over girls. Anyway, Princess Margaret, that's the Queen's younger sister, she was born at Glamis Castle. So Elizabeth II, as her personality was emerging in the 30s, she was a serious-minded child, highly responsible, perhaps a bit of a goody two-shoes, banal, if I'm being bitchy, which I always am. Anyway, so 1936, her father, George VI, becomes king. And Edward VIII, as he was, her uncle, Edward VIII, moves to France, typical move of a Briton in sexual disgrace, and he assumes the title of the Duke of Windsor. And he lives there with a woman he marries, Mrs. Simpson, who then styles herself the Duchess of Windsor. So anyway, George VI and his wife try to set this model of a family life, a morality, and they're largely successful. So they're living in Buckingham Palace most of the time, going to Windsor Castle. The Queen was privately tutored, and Sir Henry Martin, the Provost of Eton, he went to Windsor Castle, gave her private lessons quite a lot. Sometimes he taught her in Martin's library, part of Eton College. He died in 1948. You can see images of him on YouTube being knighted by King George VI just at the end of the Second World War. So for 1936, the current Queen, she was heir presumptive. Because if her father died, she would be the monarch. She would inherit the crown from her father. She was not heir apparent. She had to be heir presumptive because if her mother certainly was delivered of a son, then this boy would trump her in the line of succession because boys took precedence over girls until only about 4 years ago when the Act of Succession was changed. Anyway, in 1939, the Second World War broke out, and so the current Queen was 13 years old, and it was decided that she should have someone to write to. A lot of teenage girls were writing to their boyfriends that are slightly older, who are in the armed forces. So who better to write to than her second cousin twice removed, Prince Philip. Prince Philip, who was a Royal Naval cadet down at Dartmouth, and that was that. Prince Philip of Denmark and Greece. He was born in Corfu, Greece. He grew up somewhat in Paris, then in the United Kingdom. He'd gone to Gordonstoun School. His father was living in France with his mistress. His mother seemed to be a bit deranged, became a nun, even though she was married. He had 4 older sisters, all married to Germans. It was a mixed German and Danish ancestry. The Greek royal family really being Danish. by import and related to many royal families of Europe. So in the Second World War, the Queen, she broadcast to children around the Commonwealth. It's not filmed, but you can hear the voice recording. And her sister Margaret's beside her, and she says, "Say good night, Margaret." And her little sister pipes up, "Good night." And that's about it. So they stayed in the daytime in Buckingham Palace. They drove to Windsor Castle at night time. It wasn't hit. I'm not sure if they're aware of this, but Adolf Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to observe an exclusion zone around Windsor Castle because when he conquered Great Britain, he planned to have Windsor Castle as personal residence, which is why Eton also escaped because it's just across the Thames of Windsor Castle. And they lived on more than the rations, but they flew the flag a little bit. There was talk of them leaving to Canada, and as the Queen at the time had said, I will never leave unless the children won't leave unless I leave, and I won't leave without the King, and the King will never leave, so they stayed put. Although they were in Windsor, not in London, it wasn't as dangerous. So a scout troop was set up for her at Buckingham Palace, so she could have some activities, normal children's activities. Sorry, I should say a girl guide group rather. Girl guides and Boy Scouts were kept separate until fairly recently. And there were hand-picked girls from aristocratic families. And then when she turned 18, it was time for her to do her bit for the war effort, to join the army as a truck driver. Don't know how much that she actually did. You can see some footage of that. And famously on VE Day, you can see her up on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, waving to the adoring crowds on this moment of triumph. And she said that she and her sister Margaret, they snuck out of the Buckingham Palace. The Queen was 19. Security was very lax in those days. Someone wanted to assassinate them. I suppose they could have done so quite easily. And they mingled with the crowds and they joined in the jubilations. And they were worried they'd be recognised. Not that anyone would have done them harm, but they just would have been mobbed by people who exalted them. But no one would imagine that they were looking at Princess Elizabeth if they saw her. It's a bit like in the 70s. The Queen walked into a corner shop to buy something. And the shop assistant said, "You look just like the Queen." And she said, "How very reassuring." Anyway, you may have seen that series, The Crown, on Netflix. It's a marvellous series, by the way, and fairly accurate. But I think that was a real gem they missed there. What a magnificent scene it would have been for her and her sister Margaret to slip out of Buckingham Palace incognito in May 1945 and blend in with these the jubilant masses on Trafalgar Square. You could imagine some victorious soldier trying to snog her or something like that, having to fend him off, because that's the way it worked back then. Anyway, the Queen is a bit reserved, perhaps stilted, shy, as Tony Blair's observed. She's a traditional person. She's very dutiful. You could accuse her of being bland. She's certainly soft-spoken, tranquil, self-possessed. She'd never have to speak up because people are going to listen to her because of her position, not because she's a terribly exciting speaker. She's a very competent one. So in 1947, the royal family sailed to South Africa because they were flying the flag there. There was a danger of Jan Christian Smuts, the Prime Minister, who was pro-British, being voted out. The National Party might come in. The racist policies might get worse. Also, to thank South Africa for its involvement in the Second World War. So that was that, and the South African government hardly let them meet any black people. You can see famous footage of her playing deck games with Royal Naval officers on the ship, and she had some sort of relationship with Prince Philip. Should they get married, this is a good idea of testing them, separating them for a few months, now that the war was over, so they're really committed to this marriage. So on the 21st birthday, she broadcast from South Africa saying, "I declare that my whole life, be it long or short, shall be dedicated to the Commonwealth family to which we all belong." Well, fine words. So she sailed back to the United Kingdom. They didn't fly in those days, they sailed. And then her announcement to Prince Philip her engagement to Prince Philip was announced. And they married in September 1945. Rationing was still on. Famously, she saved up her rationing coupons to buy her wedding dress. There are various motifs for Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland on it. The Northern Ireland one probably could have applied to the whole of Ireland, though actually until 1949, the whole of Ireland was a Commonwealth realm. Yes, George VI was the King of Ireland, not just Great Britain and Northern Ireland, specifically as well the King of Ireland. It was another title of his. So her father was ailing, and owing to his infirmity, he had to save his strength for occasions when he felt the sovereign's presence was absolutely indispensable. And she had to deputise it for him on occasions and put on the scarlet tunic and ride around riding side saddle. It must be terribly uncomfortable to ride twisted, with your legs both on one side of the horse's back for these military parades taking the salute. So she's known as that was Princess Elizabeth. Right after the war, she'd been inaugurated as a druid at an Eisteddfod in Wales, like a cultural festival. Her father had cancer, so she married, and then 1 year and 2 months later, she was delivered of a boy, Charles Louis Arthur Philip. That's Prince Charles. In 1950, joined by his sister, Princess Anne. And 1960, Prince Andrew. And 1964, Prince Edward. So that was that. Then her father died in 1952. The Queen was in Kenya on a Commonwealth tour, so they had to cut it short and come home. She brought her widow's weeds, as it were, with her mourning. So she's got up in mourning. They were all black. The ladies wore black veils for her father's funeral. And obviously, 6th of February 1952, she became queen. She decided to go with her own name, Elizabeth, as a regnal name. And a lot of rot was spoken about how this was a second Elizabethan age. Just because she happened to have the same name as a 16th century monarch didn't mean that it was going to be an era of splendour or cultural achievement. She wasn't necessarily going to be a second Gloriana. So that was that. And the controversy she actually had to deal with within the royal family was 1955. Should her sister Margaret be allowed to marry Peter Townsend? Group Captain Peter Townsend was an equerry for the royal family, as a sort of an army officer, or RAF officer, who was a flunky, hanging around with them. He was divorced, was as suitable, was much older than her. There was shades of 1936, of the abdication crisis. Was this acceptable? Must remember, in the 1950s, divorce was much more unusual, was highly controversial, very disapproved of by many people. And anyway, she worked out a way how Princess Margaret could marry him, but they would be a morganatic marriage. Their children would not have royal titles and no right to inheritance, and she'd have to give up her privy purses and the money for the tax money she got, because there's a civil list. There's money that Parliament gives the royal family every year in return from the Crown estate. In fact, the taxpayer does very well out of this. So Princess Margaret decided not to marry him. Oh, what a romantic tragedy. Well, really, Princess Margaret didn't want to give up her status. That's why she didn't do it. She could have married him if she wanted to. She wasn't prevented from doing so. But she released a statement saying, I'm conscious of the Church's teaching on the indissoluble nature of Christian marriage, and mindful of my duty to the Commonwealth, I've decided not to marry Group Peter Townsend. And as she went on to say, it might have been possible to contract a civil marriage. Well, it would definitely have been possible to do so. But that's that. See it in the Crown. So the Queen, obviously, she'd been crowned in June 1953. Unfortunately, the heavens are open that day. So it's very inclement weather, but don't take it as inauspicious. And it was a magnificent coronation ceremony. That's that. So she's easily the most photographed person of all time. And she was a bit of a film star in the 1950s. And she toddled on into middle age. People got, I suppose, faintly bored of her, but she was still very much exalted. She likes her horses. She rode around her favourite horse, Burmese, for many years. And at only the age of 60 did she stop riding these royal parades. She likes her dogs, corgis, her own special breeds. She likes to watch horse racing. But I suppose she's often been exasperated by her family. She's almost never put a foot wrong in public. Once said that Manchester's not such a nice place. The Mancunians were mortally offended. The poor woman is not allowed to have preferences. They used to prefer some cities to others. So things went wrong in the family. Her cousin, Lord Harewood, got divorced because of his adultery. And Marion, that woman, then married Jeremy Thorpe, the Liberal leader who then allegedly conspired to murder his gay lover. Her sister Margaret got divorced in the 70s and had these very high-profile, torrid affairs with Roddy Llewellyn and various men half her age. So that was that. The Queen, she's always been immaculate. She's really tried to be respectable because, she knows a lot of people adulate her and strives to be worthy of them. So she's quite humble as well. Apparently, the Prince Akihito of Japan, he's now emperor, actually, about to be emperor. He said she pours tea, couldn't believe it. The servants didn't do this. Tony Blair's revealed that she really does put on the marigold gloves and wash dishes and things like that. But she stated in 2002 on her Golden Jubilee that she will not step aside. She'll go on to the very end, although she's already delegated a lot of her duties to her eldest son, the Prince of Wales. So like her father before her, she's conserving her strength for occasions when she feels her presence is absolutely essential. Anyway, I think she's splendid. She's not exciting. She's not supposed to be. But I think the world will miss her when she's gone. But people speak as though she's immortal. And, we'll have a long warning if she's about to die. Not necessarily. No 93-year-old is entirely hale. She could go in the night. You know, people can just drop dead of a heart attack at that age without any herald event. So I think we'll miss her when she's gone. We ought to appreciate her rather more.